So my name is Officer Painter. I'm with the St. George Police Department on the patrol unit. Here today we're going to be discussing the DUI investigation and what it entails.
My name is Brian Groves. I'm a police officer of St. George as well. We all work the front half graveyard shift where there's a lot of DUI enforcement that occurs.
I'm Officer Nathan Lemke, again with St. George Police Department, and it's fun to be here and talking about a very important subject like DUI enforcement.
So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to answer questions. The first question that we are going to ask or answer is why are DUI investigations important?
It's a good question. I think probably what comes to most people's minds when you talk about DUI investigations is the crashes that are oftentimes involved with impaired drivers. We've all seen on the news, right? Horrific crash. There's been multiple family members lost, and the investigating agency is looking at it and saying that alcohol or drugs might have played a part in that. So I think probably that's one of the most important things in my mind as to why they're important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think with the injuries, we have here in St. George Police Department, we have an accident reconstruction team that's called out at any accident that involves serious bodily injury or death. Part of that accident reconstruction team, we have multiple officers who have additional training in DUI enforcement, drug recognition experts and stuff like that, that go out and they perform DUI investigations into those individuals involved in the crash to determine whether impairment was a factor in that crash. The reason why we do that is anytime there's serious injury or death, we want to make sure that the investigation is extremely thorough, because in an accident, in a collision, there's always someone at fault, and in order to bring justice for the victims in that, especially if there's death or serious bodily injury, we as a department just want to make sure that we are conducting the most thorough investigation as possible.
I'd also add that just kind of the aspect or the facet of the effect on family and community. I don't know. I think there are a lot of people who are who make a mistake. It's a one-off thing. They had too much to drink or whatever it was, and they're arrested for DUI, and it never happens to them again. I think there are others who we meet kind of on a regular basis, who this is a pattern, and maybe this a DUI investigation and arrest is the thing that's going to change behavior, and what does that look like for a spouse? What does that look like for children? Maybe mom or dad have this intervention, so to speak, and it really changes the atmosphere within a family. So I think there's a hope there too that a DUI enforcement will have an effect such as that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know we've all had a similar experience on the shifts that we work, where we have arrested the same person for driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol several times in a year even. And so you do have those individuals that are what we call frequent flyers. They're not the one-off. They're not the person who gets that one-time mistake. It's repeatedly. It's a lifestyle. They do it all the time.
Absolutely.
They say that when an officer does catch somebody driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, on average, they've probably done it around 80 times before that, 80, before actually being pulled over and caught. So it's a thing that some people do on a regular basis without thinking about it. So there's that facet too.
Agreed. So one of you guys can take it
Yeah,
away.
I'll take this one. What does a DUI investigation look like? And I can probably start that off again, thinking about, a lot of people have seen episodes of cops, or they maybe have driven by police on the side of the road and have somebody out there, and you can see them doing the eye test or walking the line and things like that. So it's something I think that people are vaguely familiar with, what it looks like. But a DUI investigation typically for us is going to start out with one of two things, right? It's going to start out with a traffic violation that one of us has observed. We're on patrol, we're driving, and we see the vehicle in front of us weaving out of their lane, right, almost hitting the curb, or they make a right-hand turn and they don't use a signal and it's really wide and they go out of the other lane. Something like that typically will attract our attention and start off a DUI investigation. Or the other way is, right, we will get a call, citizen will call in. That happens quite a bit, where a citizen calls in and says, hey, I'm following this car and they're all over the road, they're slowing down, they're speeding up, I think they might be intoxicated. Yep, they're swerving. And then we will attempt to intercept that and start an investigation that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Those ones are important. a lot of people think that it's just our job to enforce any kind of law that's being broken. But especially in a city our size, it's becoming really, really important for citizens to become involved. And that includes calling in when they see crime happening, because that's the vast majority of the crime that we're going to be able to fix and we're going to be able to catch is that we partner with the citizens to do that. I would say the vast majority of our DUI arrests come from the citizens calling it in and letting us know, and then officers are able to respond to that. I mean, multiple eyes are a lot better than one for sure.
Officer Groves talked about kind of the initial thing that might pique an officer's interest in, a driving pattern or a violation or something like that, and then of course would come a traffic stop, and then there's that contact with the driver. And I kind of think about at that time the officer is using all 5 of their senses. I mean, you're detecting odors, you're observing what's going on in the vehicle, observing what's going on with the driver. How are they, handling their registration or their wallet or their keys or whatever it is. What we're observing. What do their eyes look like? What does their speech sound like? So at that point, you're kind of just gathering information, observing. Is this person's mannerisms, are their behaviors normal for just the average citizen? Are they just nervous because they got pulled over by the police? And let's be real, like if I got pulled over, I'd probably be nervous. Because that's a normal that's a normal thing, and you kind of have to be able to cut through that and see, is this behavior, are these mannerisms, are they something that's coming from impairment, or is it just a person who just simply happens to be normal? And then of course your officers looking in the vehicle. Is there anything in plain sight? Is there anything in view? Open containers, drug paraphernalia, those kinds of things that can kind of pique interest even more. So there's that initial contact with the driver and even the passengers that is important.
Mm-hmm. And then once the officer has determined they have suspicion that the driver may be under the influence. From there, we move into the field sobriety test portion of it. Normally what that looks like is the officer that's done the traffic stop or made the traffic stop, he'll call for a backup unit to respond. Once that officer has a backup there, we'll approach again. We'll ask the driver to step out of the vehicle with us. And that is right then is when the DUI investigation starts, because there's a lot of clues when people exit vehicles and how they exit the vehicle that is very important in a DUI investigation. Whether they're using the vehicle to help remain balanced, whether they're staggering as they walk. A lot of times we'll see people try to hide open containers or drugs as they're getting out because they have it stuffed under their leg. So it starts from there. We take them to a place that is the best suited for field sobriety tests, and then from there we'll conduct field sobriety tests with them in order to determine whether they're impaired or whether, like Officer Lemke said, one of those other factors are coming into play, whether it's nervousness or something along those lines. So that's what the next step is. We'll let Gross talk a little bit about the field sobriety test portion.
Yeah, the field sobriety test. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or they're called NHTSA, they have a series of standardized tests that we use. They're called the standard field sobriety tests. There's 3 of them that are typically used by officers. The first one is called the horizontal gaze nystagmus, and that is an eye test where we are looking for what is called nystagmus. It's an involuntary jerking of the eyes that can be caused by alcohol consumption and some drugs as well. And there are certain clues that officers are trained to look for during that test. The next one that we do is the 9-step walk and turn. That's one that a lot of people are familiar with. It's probably the most familiar one, where there's the line on the ground and they have to walk down the line, turn around, and walk back. There's multiple clues that we're trained to observe on that test as well. And then the third one that's given is called the one-leg stand, where we have them stand on one leg for a short amount of time. They're given specific instructions to follow, and then we just document the clues that are seen during those tests. Now, each of those tests has basically what we call an arrest point, or a point where if a certain number of clues are met, then there is a high probability being the key word in this, that the individual is under the influence of alcohol or drugs to the point that they can't safely operate a motor vehicle. One thing that is important for the public, I think, to understand is that field sobriety tests, they are not objective, they are subjective. Okay, it's not like we can take this individual on the side of the road and put them in a science lab setting and get precise points and go, yep, this person is under the influence and they should be arrested. And if not, boom, they move on. It's a decision actually that has to be made on scene by the officer with the taking in to consideration the totality of the circumstances. So a combination, right, of the driving pattern, the traffic violations that we're seeing, what Officer Lemke and Painter talked about, that initial contact, those indicators of consumption of alcohol or drugs, getting out of the vehicle, using it for balance, and then you combine that with the field sobriety test, and then the officer ultimately comes to the point where they have to make a decision. Is this individual impaired to the point that they can't safely operate a motor vehicle?
Yep.
And if not, if those suspicions are dispelled in those field sobriety tests, which happens routinely with us, we do field sobriety tests on individuals all the time.
Yep.
And determine, okay, that's not what's going on here. There's no criminal activity. This is a member of what we call the innocent motoring public.
Yep.
And we send them on their way.
Yep. No, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. Yeah, and I think one of the big things here to remember is we get told a lot, even if, I mean, it's funny when they say, even if I'm sober, if I was sober, I couldn't pass this, but we get a lot of comments where people say, these tests were designed to fail, but the reality of that is that's actually not true. The tests have been standardized and studied in multiple different field studies where they brought a bunch of people together, just like they do a regular field study. Some are given placebo, some are given alcohol, and then they bring a bunch of the lay officer, right, regular patrol officers in to do field sobriety tests. And they all perform them, and they have to determine impairment or not, and even to the point where they have to try to determine level of alcohol or level of impairment, and that's how they standardize it to meet certain percentages for the probability of them being over a legal per se limit or impaired. So it's been standardized, it's been studied countless times, many times, and it's a proven science almost. There is a margin of error there because we're human at the end of the day. We're not robots, and it is subjective, but it has been studied, and it is very, very accurate in my experience. There's very, very few times in my career where I've seen someone who just completely bombs them, and there's not a mitigating factor there.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. The next part of that DUI investigation would be after the arrest is made.
Right. If a decision is made to arrest, then obviously we would place that person in handcuffs, and then again, just as the field sobriety tests are very they're particular in the way that they are to be handled, there is some procedure that comes after the arrest. There are certain things that we have to do. There's a citation through the state that we go through in a very systematic way. We would arrest that person. We would take them to a location where we could gather a breath sample from or request a breath sample, and then that arrestee has some decisions that they get to make. They get to choose whether or not they want to give a breath sample. So there's some conversation that's often had there. If they choose to comply with our request for a breath sample, we would use what's called an intoxilizer machine. That, if I'm honest, it looks like something out of like a 1980s 100%. Sci-fi movie or something. I don't know, but it's a very technical piece of advice, though it doesn't look like it. It is checked routinely by the state, and has to be so, because it is obviously we're talking about people's freedoms. We're talking about an investigation that is important, and so we need accurate evidence, and that's what that machine does. We're gathering evidence to substantiate an arrest or to help us investigate the crime of DUI. So we would gather that sample if the person decides to do so. If they choose not to provide a sample, at that point we would make a decision where we might write a warrant, and we have several trained phlebotomists that would come, and we might do a blood draw. If it is we kind of get in this pattern. We think about alcohol-related DUIs, but it might be that we suspect this person has been using methamphetamines or marijuana or whatever it is, prescription drugs.
And wouldn't you say that probably at least half? We're probably right now seeing. Yeah, I'll bet you half of our DUI arrests are drugs. His are a little bit higher with his DRE experience,
right?
But it's about half and half alcohol and drugs,
right? And so intoxilizer in that case is irrelevant. And so in that case, we would request a blood sample or a urine sample, whatever it is, in order to gather that evidence to further the investigation.
Then after that, we get done with the DUI process, and you get put back in the car, and you go spend the night in jail.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, actions have consequences, and everyone out there, everyone out there has been informed and understands that if you drive impaired, the consequences of those actions is going to jail. So it's not anything that's a surprise to anybody. The state of Utah has spent a lot of money focusing on the DUI doesn't just mean booze, and just telling you the ramifications for making that kind of decision to drive impaired. So everybody's aware of it, and you go to jail if you're DUI. That's just the cold hard truth.
Cold hard truth, and it's phenomenal to me. I mean, I know you all have had the same experience. It's always amazing to me to have discussions with individuals that have been arrested for DUI. And when you mention the word Uber or Lyft or taxi, what do they do every time?
Shut up.
I should. Yeah, right. $10, $12, $15, and you can go to the bar, have a drink or whatever you're doing, and get home, and it's safe and it's great. It's convenient. Yeah.
I think we're missing as part a requirement of the state is in part of this investigation is vehicle impound.
Oh, right.
So after the arrest is made, an officer, that backup officer generally would do an inventory of the vehicle, which documents kind of everything that's in the vehicle for safeguarding the department and individual's property. So then the vehicle would be impounded, and that is something that is another kind of a consequence of that DUI arrest.
As of today, the state fee for an impound, I think, is $350, somewhere in there. Additional to that, you also have to pay the impound lot for coming out in the middle of the night after hours, impounding the vehicle, a daily fee at the lot. It's an expensive choice for sure. Whereas maybe at very most, even if you live far away, you're looking $30, $40 tops for an Uber. It's just
right. And what's the average they say on a start to finish if you get arrested for a DUI?
$10,000.
Roughly $10,000. It's what you can maybe plan on that costing you, especially with attorney fees. So yeah, it's interesting. That's for sure. One thing I wanted to touch on the DUI investigations too, that a lot of people overlook, is the implied consent law. A lot of people don't understand that when you go and you get a driver's license, doesn't matter what state, all 50 states have this law. But you go into the driver's license division, you fill out the application, you sign your name, and they hand you a driver's license. By signing your name on that document, you have given what's called implied consent, meaning that if a police officer ever stops you and suspects that you're driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and then requests from you that you provide what we call a chemical test, and that can be blood, urine, breath, oral fluids, any of those things. And by the way, that is determined by the officer, not by the person who's been arrested. That's determined by the officer. If you choose not to give that sample, okay, that is then the driver's license division can take significant action on your driver's license, including revocation. And oftentimes those revocations at a minimum are 18 months and can be all the way up to 3 years. They also come with other consequences, like an ignition interlock device that you have to have installed on your car for a minimum of 3 years. And the average of those are like $90 to $100 a month to rent. And that cost is on the person.
And the fines.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So there's a lot of other ramifications.
Yeah. So what kind of training do officers go through in order to be trained to conduct DUI investigations? Officer Groves mentioned the NHTSA standards that we have to abide by when we're investigating DUIs, and that seed is planted in police academy. So I was pretty recently through that, and so there is time that's spent during police academy where an instructor will come, and as Officer Groves mentioned, the 3 tests, the horizontal gaze nystagmus, the 9-step walk and turn, and the 1-leg stand. There's significant amount of time spent in the classroom just going through those, looking at the clues. What are we looking for? That nystagmus, that involuntary jerking of the eyes, that takes practice. It can be a very subtle thing, and so officers need to have a good understanding of what that looks like, what you're looking for, and that begins in police academy. For us, they did what's called a wet lab. So they would have individuals come in, 10 or 15, I think it was that day, and they would volunteer to consume different varying amounts of alcohol from, one beer just so the odor is there, up to an amount that would definitely get somebody over the legal limit, the per se limit in the state of Utah. So at that point, officers have an opportunity to kind of hone their skills, practice the things that they've learned, go through the tests, and see what that's about. And then once out of police academy, all that training is there, hired on by a department. And then I think the next step would come during field training and with the department training. So hopefully I shouldn't say hopefully, you would be placed with a field training officer who would be trained in DUI investigation, and you would just start getting that real life exposure, which is very, very different than anything that you see in a classroom and anything that you might see in a wet lab, because it's real life. Now we're talking about real life.
I'm glad you bring that up. That's a great point. I've talked to many defense attorneys who fancy themselves experts in DUIs, and one thing that I've always found interesting is that those attorneys, those people, have never actually had to run somebody through field sobriety tests in an actual enforcement situation. Very, very different from a classroom, because you are talking to someone who, if they're impaired, if they've had too much to drink or they've used drugs to the point that they're impaired, they are going to jail. This is not
life altering.
This is not a wet lab where it's jolly and we're happy,
And
we're volunteering, we're having a good time. There's no pressure, there's no anxiety, there's nothing.
Exactly.
Yes, it's extremely different, and that can be a very daunting thing to an officer as well, to realize, well, here I am now. This is not the academy. I'm actually having to make a decision that's going to affect this person's life.
Right.
And that can be. It takes, in my opinion, it takes a lot of courage for officers on the street to get good at these investigations, number one, and then to make the decisions to arrest when they should be arresting people that are under the influence.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
And with that field training, we're blessed to have some very good officers who are very capable DUI investigators.
Yeah.
But it can be as basic as I've seen Officer Groves hold a trainee's hand and just because the timing is important for when looking at nystagmus, all those kinds of things. So it's very, we want to set a good foundation, and then just kind of comes the ongoing training and repetition and getting practice and doing tests, and that's kind of on us.
100%.
And to do, we do classes every once in a while where it's good just to go and refresh.
And I would say on average, I mean, when we're training a new officer, right, on average on grave shift, we can usually get a new officer into between 5 and a dozen or so DUIs during their training period.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That's not a lot, but it does give them some kind of a foundation. And then, of course, once they get out on their own on the street,
It's up to them.
it's up to them. There's in-service, what we call in-service training. There's DUI refreshers, field sobriety test refreshers. There's
Toxilizer certifications.
Toxilizer certifications. There's trainings online you can take and stuff like that, as well as I know a lot of officers who devote some of their personal time even to studying DUI law, studying DUI investigations, and then just bettering themselves at them because they're complicated.
I know my spouse could probably be an expert, because when I was going through the academy, I think I did field sobriety tests on her at home more times than I can count, because we needed someone to practice with, and on friends and family and stuff like that. And then additional trainings the officers can go to. There's if you want to become a good DUI cop, you can do additional trainings in law enforcement. We have ARIDE, which essentially is advanced roadside, right? So that teaches officers to look for things kind of outside of the alcohol DUI, right? It teaches you how different drug categories affect the human body, how the indicators that you can see while you're at roadside with them that would lead you to that determination. It also teaches you additional tests that we use at roadside in addition to NHTSA standard to determine that, right? We still have NHTSA standard, and we still have to have some NHTSA standard clues there to prove the impairment, but then these ARIDE tests and these DRE tests that we do, they will help us to say, okay, well, it's not alcohol. It looks like it could be a controlled substance or a prescription medication or something like that.
And that's really important when we talk about the percentage of DUI arrests that are made, and we're looking at, it 50-50, and in your case, even higher on the side of something other than alcohol.
And if you're wondering, for those listening, what Officer Painter's referring to when he says ARIDE, ARIDE stands for Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement. It's just, we use a lot of acronyms in law enforcement, right?
And DRE is?
And DRE,
Drug recognition expert.
yeah, which Officer Painter here is a drug recognition expert. He's gone to a lot higher level of training than your standard patrol officer would. Even your standard officer who does a lot of DUI investigations, he's gone to a much higher level of training to be able to recognize people that are impaired specifically on drugs. And when we talk about drugs, right, not just illegal drugs,
Nope.
but prescription drugs as well.
And the prescription drugs is the big thing, because a lot of people don't understand that they, most likely if they're prescribed oxycodone or something like that, on the pill bottle, it's very clear. It says to use caution when operating machinery. So they think they can take that and drive. And some people can. If their tolerance is low, they're not taking a heavy dosage, they might be able to. But if even your prescribed prescription causes impairment, you can't. Right now, St. George Police Department has 2 certified drug recognition experts. We have a lot of officers that are certified as ARIDE officers. But as of recent, because the trend is more and more drug DUIs that we're seeing, especially with the legalization of cannabis and stuff like that, we're getting a lot of more impaired driving from drugs. And the department is looking into kind of ramping up our DRE group, so we have more officers that are trained, so we can go to these fatal accidents and like these big priority potential DUIs and have officers that are really trained being there. So it'll be important for sure moving forward with our department. So how can someone be arrested for DUI if they aren't drunk? So I know me, and I know both of you have definitely had multiple drug DUIs where when you do field sobriety tests, they're like, I'm not drunk, I haven't had anything to drink. And at the end of that, when you tell them they're under arrest for DUI, they look confused. They're like, what do you mean? Give me a breathalyzer. I'll pass right now. And it takes some education to tell them, DUI isn't just being drunk. It doesn't just mean alcohol. I know the state of Utah has paid a lot of money for billboards all across Utah that say DUI doesn't just mean booze, right? And it's important to understand that, because the lack of understanding that it's impaired driving, right? We're looking for impaired driving, and there's a lot of substances out there, including controlled substances, prescriptions that aren't controlled, like gabapentin and stuff like that. Illegal drugs. Cough syrup can even cause it if you're drinking cough syrup and you have a lot of it. We get a lot of huffing DUIs out here where they're buying condensed air and they're huffing it and it's making them high, and those are really bad. They crash pretty much 9 times out of 10 on that.
Yeah, those in the triple C's, those cough medications that they'll take the whole thing. I had some kids behind a building the other day drinking Delsum cough syrup, an entire bottle. You think about what would happen to you if you drink an entire bottle of Delsum cough syrup.
Yeah,
you will be impaired,
right?
And that will come back in a blood test.
Yeah, and so there's all kinds of things that can cause that. Oftentimes too, we think about, okay, if somebody's driving drunk, right? Well, that means that they're staggering around. They maybe have urinated on themselves. They can't talk. They fall out of the truck, or when you pull them over, these sorts of things. Most of our even alcohol DUIs, I would say, they're not like that. And I'm sure we've all heard the adage, right? Impairment begins with the first drink.
Yep.
Right? And that can equally be applied to impairment begins with the first pill or the first puff on that of that marijuana or whatever it is that you're doing. So many people think that in order to be arrested for driving under the influence, you have to just be falling down and impaired. And that's not true. We think about alcohol and drugs and the effect it has on your motor skills, your reaction time, your thought process, all of these things that we require to safely operate a motor vehicle.
Yep.
Right? You think about what's the average reaction time when you're driving for you to react, see a threat, hit your brake, 0.75 seconds?
Yeah,
that's someone who's sober. And as soon as you add that first beer, you add that first pill, that first puff on the pipe or whatever, that time now increases.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people don't understand that. So.
Yeah, it definitely comes with some education. And Utah law spells it out. When you're looking at intoxication or impaired driving, I've had even just debates with other officers who really don't. They're learning DUIs. They're newer. They're trying to understand it. And when we're doing DUI investigations, we're not looking for the intoxicated person, right? Intoxication means essentially they're at a level to where they're a danger to themselves or other. Utah law specifically lays out impairment for DUIs as being unsafe to operate a vehicle, right? So, and that's not just motor vehicle, that's vehicle. Electric scooters, riding lawnmowers, anything like that where you're operating it. DUI is not just on a public roadway. It can be in private property or anything like that, and we run into that a lot. Boats.
Yeah, we
Yep.
have our parks guys out at Sand Hollow and these
Yep.
other places that there's people that get arrested there all the time for driving a boat while intoxicated.
Yep, 100%.
So, absolutely. Let me take this one.
Yeah. That's
All right, so
yeah.
let's talk about. I've heard a lot of discussion. We all have.
100%.
A couple of years ago, Utah changed their law, and we are now the lowest in the nation with a .05 breath alcohol concentration limit. That's the per se limit, meaning in the state of Utah, if you're over that .05, you are considered DUI. You are considered, DUI. A lot of people had a heartache with that. I know there was a lot of pushback on social media. There was a lot of pushback with the legislature about how that was going to drive people out of Utah and that it was going to turn a bunch of people into criminals and it was going to affect tourism. I know from our end in law enforcement, we have not seen any significant change at all in the way that we do DUI investigations. In fact, it hasn't changed at all. I'll give you an example. For the last 2 years, my average breath alcohol concentration for all of my DUIs, and there's been roughly 300 or so over the last 2 years, 0.10.
Yeah, mine was like a point.
And yours was
19
real
or
similar,
20.
right there. Yeah, yours was right there. I know, Olympia, yours was going to be the same as well. So we think about that, right? Compare that to a .05. The average person that we're arresting for DUI is still twice the .05 limit. We arrest very few individuals at that point, between a .05 and a .08.
That's the anomaly.
That's
I think
the anomaly.
being in that range that's the anomaly. In the people
and
who are
occasionally
driving.
that will happen, right? Occasionally that will happen. You talk about alcohol and how it affects people.
Mhm.
I mean, occasionally you will get, like, for example, a female who's very small, hasn't had anything to eat, and she went to the bar and she had a drink. She may be a .05 or a .06, but very impaired, fails the test. She should not be operating a motor vehicle. Where if I went to the bar with nothing to eat and drank a beer, the guy on my side, it wouldn't affect me at all, right? So it just depends. It affects everybody differently, but to put your minds at ease as far as that .05 goes, don't believe people when they tell you that it's turning everybody into criminals, because it's nothing really has changed.
Our tests are exactly the same, and we're looking for the exact same amount of clues when we're doing the tests to determine that. It all comes down to the same thing. The level on your breath isn't even checked with a accurate reading until we have already arrested you and take you to the police department.
And I think that's a really good point, because we hear people a lot say, "Oh, just give me a breath test," and that's not the way that these DUI investigations unfold. We are looking for clues of impairment. We are using those NHTSA standards. We are going through all of those tests, and at the very end is when we finally collect that breath sample, whether it be roadside or through the intoxilyzer machine. So,
Take that one.
yeah, what happens after a DUI arrest? So now we're talking about, we've made an arrest, we've gathered evidence. Individual's been booked and processed at the jail. So now we have a semi-lengthy report to write, depending on the circumstances. And and I think that goes with police work. I had no idea how much typing I would end up doing. But I mentioned the citation that we have to do. So there's a citation we do for the state, and then our department requires that we write a report for our DUIs. So those two things need to be handled. That's time consuming, anywhere from an hour plus, depending on what's involved in the case and evidence. And if there is evidence, then we're booking it, whether it be, marijuana or whatever kind of drug it is, or paraphernalia, or documenting alcohol, open containers, things like that. If there's a crash involved in a DUI, that adds a whole nother kind of layer to what has to be done. So there's potentially hours worth of paperwork that has to be processed. From there, when a person is arrested for DUI, there's a court date that will be set out, and that's down the line a little bit. There is a hearing with the driver license division that generally happens pretty quickly, within a month or maybe or so of a DUI arrest. So officers are required to be prepared and be ready to provide statements in a DLD hearing, and then moving forward with a court proceedings, which vary depending on circumstances and
Yep.
and involvement with defense attorneys and those kinds of things, it can be pretty quickly, I think, that some of these things are resolved out of court without anybody ever even having to step foot in the courthouse. And at other times there are, suppression hearings and
Preliminary
those kinds of
hearings,
preliminary hearings,
pretrials,
all
yeah.
that kind of stuff, pretrial stuff. So they can drag out for years,
All the
honestly.
way up to a trial.
And if we have, a case involving a fatality, that can, that just adds to it. So
Yeah, a long time for that one.
yeah, after the arrest, it can be a very short timeline, all the way up to years and years and years.
Absolutely.
Yep. So let's talk for just a minute about the difficulties that officers face when they're enforcing DUI laws. I think probably one of the first difficulties that I want to talk about is, well, there's two things. So number one, DUIs. What is interesting about DUIs from the perspective of a patrol officer is that it is the one crime that runs the entire gamut
100%.
of people in your community. Police officers have been arrested for DUI, firefighters, paramedics, doctors,
Politicians.
lawyers, politicians, city council members, news anchors, you name it, sports figures. I think about that crash in Vegas just recently. It runs the entire gamut. So when you're enforcing DUI laws and you're out there on the street and you're pulling a vehicle over for a traffic infraction, or you're seeing a driving pattern and stuff, you don't know who's behind the wheel of that car and who you might be running into and now taking them to jail for a DUI investigation.
Yeah.
So that's the first difficulty that officers face.
Yeah, it's very personal.
It's a very
Very
personal, because in this arrest, more than so many others, you spend a good amount of time with this person,
In very close proximity.
and it's very close proximity. The conversations that ensue during these can be very personal conversations. So yeah, that can be a difficult thing. The second thing is that I can't really think of a more technical
Yeah.
arrest that a patrol
Scrutinized.
officer is going to make on a routine basis.
Yeah.
You go and you handle a retail theft call, or you handle an assault at the bar, or something of that nature. They aren't nearly as complicated, and there aren't nearly as many policies and procedures that have to be exactly followed in a certain order and done in a certain way as a DUI
Yeah, 100%.
investigation. So it's very complicated arrest.
And I would add to that, those standards have to be met. It has to be. It's a very precise, thing that we're doing, and that might be taking place at 1:30 in the morning in the parking lot of a bar with rowdy people heckling and doing. And so the environment only adds. It might be pouring rain,
Yep.
and you're being asked to conduct a solid investigation, holding to these standards, these NHTSA standards, in environments that are crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
I
So,
did that one in
yeah,
the snow the other day.
yeah. Hey, having come from northern Utah, I did these investigations in snow all the time on snow-packed roads. You have no control over the environment that you may be doing this in.
And add in the level of cooperation from your potential arrestee.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
varies.
sometimes it's great, but other times, probably the majority of them, they're not happy to be going through what they're going through, especially if they know that they usually know the end result, right? They know if they're driving and they shouldn't be.
Mhm.
So they know, well, as soon as they get out and do those tests, they're hoping we don't catch them. But at the end of the day, they know what's coming,
Yeah.
And that's one thing for sure on this, like Officer Grove said, is there's a lot involved in DUI enforcement, and there's a lot of steps that we have to follow. There's long reports. I mean, my reports are anywhere from 4 to 6 pages long for a DUI. If I do a DRE evaluation on them, it's an additional 3 pages. And you go to the driver's license division hearing. You get scrutinized there for every little thing you do. You go to the trial, you get scrutinized because there's certain things you have to do specifically, and we're humans, right?
Mhm.
Humans make mistakes sometimes.
Yep.
And it scares officers. There's a lot of officers out there that, man, when they get a DUI, they're terrified of what is to come of that, because they don't want, they want to do everything to the best of their abilities as well. And you have to continuously practice and refine your craft in order to be able to get through these without a little scrutiny.
One other thing I wanted to talk about too, DUI investigations. you really have to, when we talk about difficulties, some officers have a difficult time with the interpersonal skills that it takes to do a good DUI investigation.
100%.
You talked about getting the cooperation. We can't do this investigation without the cooperation of the person that
Yep.
we've pulled over, that we suspect might be under the influence. And so you learn to have very good interpersonal skills with people. You learn language, mannerisms, a tone of voice, these sorts of things to try to put the person at ease as
Yep.
much as you can, because it's an uncomfortable situation. Like you pointed out, that they probably know the end result, and they get nervous. It's a lot of anxiety. There's tons of tension and anxiety that's present. And you're more successful as a DUI investigator if you're able to cut through that a little bit, put them at ease, build some rapport with the individual that you're dealing with. And I'm sure that you guys have had the same thing happen to you. I can't tell you how many times people have thanked me when I get them to the jail. By the time we get there, we've had a good conversation
Sure,
about
respectful.
life and about the situation that they're in. And that just comes from treating another human being who's made a poor decision, right? That's granted. We still have to do our job. But it comes from treating them with respect and with dignity, and kind of helping them through that process, even though you still have to do your job and they are still going to go to jail.
Yep.
And then think about the people we don't arrest. I mean, those interpersonal skills and the respect, and you want people to be at ease, because we're not, our job is not to try to get people to, we're not like, we want people to drive safely. We want people to be safe. And if you're not impaired, we don't want to make an arrest, right? And so if we're acting in such a way or behaving in such a way that's gonna cause people to stumble or be over nervous or whatever it is, we want to be able to provide an atmosphere, because we respect people. We want to be respectful.
Absolutely.
We want to conduct a good investigation with high integrity, honesty, all those kinds of things, because it's important.
And I know for me, and you guys probably feel the same way, I'm always relieved when I find a designated driver.
Yeah, you're like, oh, thank you. Yeah, good.
Yes, and I'm not writing you a ticket.
No, you're getting a
that.
warning.
You're getting a warning,
Drove
because I
responsibly.
so appreciate the fact that you're driving this carload of drunk people.
Yeah.
And getting them where they need to go safely, and you are not impaired either. I'm always
100%.
relieved when I find those.
Yeah.
That's good.
No, I agree.
I like it.
Excellent. Okay. So I did some research over the last couple weeks of DUI arrests or charges since in the last X amount of years, right? Because I was interested to see. I feel like the DUIs have just gotten out, and there's an outrageous amount of them recently, right? I feel like every night. I mean, there's been nights where you've arrested 4 DUIs in one night. I've done 3 or 4 DUIs in one night, and a patrol shift of 7 guys. We're in a line.
We're looking around thinking, what in the world is going on?
Yeah, we have a line
Everybody
of
in the
people.
city driving drunk?
Yeah. So I did some research. So in 2018, we had 246 DUIs. Okay. In 2019, it dipped off just a little bit with 221 DUIs. But from there, we've more than doubled. And from 2019 to 2020, we went from 221 DUIs up to 460 DUIs. So St. George, the police department, and this is just St. George. This isn't Washington County. This isn't Washington City. This is just within St. George city limits and St. George officers. It over doubled to 460 DUIs in 2020. So 2021, just last year, we ended the year with 619 DUIs as a department.
So it increased another third after that.
Yep. And then this year, I did the math on it, and we're already on track to have way more than 619. We were averaging, when I checked last, we were averaging like 2 DUI arrests a day moving into this year. So I mean, that's over 700 for the end of this year if it keeps at that track.
That's a lot. That's a lot. I'm sure that there's a lot of things that factor into that, which we won't get into here. However, needless to say, that paints a pretty bleak picture of the DUIs that are going on in the city of St. George, and the need for the community to, in my opinion, get more involved. There's so many other options other than getting behind the wheel of your car impaired.
Yeah, and we would add that we are relieved when we see designated drivers. We are relieved when we see people, maybe have a little too much to drink and stagger over to an Uber and take a seat in the back seat and make it home safely. That's outstanding for us. We are relieved when, people take it upon themselves to call in when they see something that is seemingly unsafe. It's important for us to have a community that cares about this, because it affects the community. You know, if your son or daughter is walking across the street and they happen to be hit by somebody who's DUI, you know, and somebody maybe saw something before that occurred and thought, yeah, they'll make it home, or it's gonna be okay, or you know, maybe I didn't see what I actually saw, and if that intervention was made, perhaps a life would be spared. And I know that's a kind of an extreme thing, but that's the reality of the situation. Is we have an opportunity to help keep our community safe. We talk about among the department, we have a hashtag IMSGPD, and that's not just for us. We wear a uniform, but we ask our community to partner with us in keeping our citizens safe, and it's essential. You know, we have a limited number of officers that are driving around in patrol cars, but we have a lot of citizens fortunately we have a lot who are willing to take part in this, and I think there are more that could.
Absolutely. Those things can be easy to rationalize in your mind. I'm sure we've all heard the old mantra, every citizen a police officer. And I believe that that's the truth. The only difference between regular citizens in the community and us who are wearing a uniform is that we happen to be sworn and paid full time to direct our attention towards these issues all the time. Normal citizens are going to go about their lives, working their business, taking kids to school, living their lives, being with their families, doing their things. However, they're all out in the community, all these eyes and ears, seeing things. And we absolutely depend on individuals to make that decision, and it takes courage. It takes courage to be that citizen who says, you know what, no, I'm not.
That's not right.
I like where I live. St. George is a great community, and I'm going to do my part when I see that guy on the road swerving all over the place, or I see the kids in the back alley spray paint graffiti, whatever it is that you see, if you happen to be there, step up, have the courage to say something about it, because you don't ever know the ramifications of that down the line. You know, we arrest somebody for DUI, right? We don't know whose life we just saved that night.
That person would have killed someone.
That person could have driven down the road and killed someone. And I take it personal, I know you guys too, when we have these crashes in our city and someone's life is significantly affected, they're either killed, they're injured seriously, I always think to myself, what if I could have caught that?
Yeah.
What if I
100%.
could have been there, I could have caught that guy a mile up the road for an improper lane travel or something and arrested him before it got to that point.
Yes.
So you as a citizen, that's where you make a difference, is that you can be that person that can stop that or prevent that.
Absolutely.